Second time's a charm, y'all. First time I did this, I screwed it up. Okay, all right. Let's talk about aquatic pollution, water pollution. Everybody's not favorite topic. All right. So this first part, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how water gets polluted, specifically by people and our livestock and our feces, our poop. And then we're going to kind of look at what technologies we can use to treat it. So first, some terms to know. So water pollution is whenever we pollute any source of water, obviously. Wastewater is what we call the bad, ooky water that goes into these nice, clean bodies of water that may be contaminated with livestock feces, human sewage, and then also gray water. So what gray water is, it's whenever you take a shower, it's what goes down the drain. It doesn't necessarily contain the bad, icky, gross sewage, but it doesn't mean it's clean. It does contain detergents and stuff like that. Now, that leads us to, there's two types of pollution that we need to know. There is what we call point source and non-point source. Point source pollution that's the type of pollution where we can look upstream and we know that pollution came from there. And the reason why that is, say that factory is the only factory along the river that spells whatever compound into the water. Okay. Say an organic compound. Okay. So you're like, I know that is the source of this pollutant because we can trace it back. So point source means it can be easily or fairly easily traced back to its original source. However, non-point source, we don't know. And there's a lot of reasons why we may not know. Like fertilizer, all the different farms are going to use similar fertilizers. They're all going to have nitrates and phosphates in there. So whenever it all ends up back in the water, in the river, we don't know which farm it came from. We just know it came from agriculture. So there's that. But then too, let's say we have massive rains, it floods. Everybody in the neighborhood treated their lawns. Again, similar situation. All of that runs off. We can't necessarily pinpoint one sort, where it all came from, because at that point, it comes from everywhere. So there's the difference between point source and non-point source. So it can be challenging to try to trace back and identify this, but it can also be very important too, to help mediate the issue. All right, so wastewater can cause different problems. One of those is oxygen demand, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Nutrient release is related to that. And then we're going to talk about disease-causing organisms. Yeah. All right, so first, let's talk about oxygen. Oxygen on demand. Now, what does that mean? It's really meaning biochemical oxygen demand. We call it BOD, BOD. So what is it? In the shortest, simplest way I can explain it is this. It's how much oxygen a body of water uses in a certain period of time. But there are a lot of factors that go into it. It could be based on time of year, so temperature, how much rainfall they're receiving. It could be dependent on what's living in the body of water itself, the health of the water already. So there's a lot of things here that can affect it. So let me give you a couple of scenarios. BOD can change by temperature because of this. Oxygen dissolves better in cold weather. The colder it is, the better gases dissolve. All right. Yeah. Kind of the opposite from what you would think, but that is the way it works. So colder temperatures, a lot of times we actually have better dissolved oxygen values in the water. Hotter, not so much. So the effect of that is in summer, we can tend to have the higher oxygen demand because there's not as much oxygen available being produced in the water or that's staying dissolved in the water. Another thing could be you could have thermal pollution, which is when you have hot substances, it could be water, could be other byproducts dumped into the water, which therefore raises the temperature, making some of that dissolved oxygen come out of the water and evaporate into the atmosphere. So that's one thing. Then you can also have issues where we'll talk about coming up, and I'll give you some more examples. But this can create dead zones. And dead zones are where you have very low oxygen availability. And those low oxygen concentrations create toxic situations. They cannot support life. Organisms that are not photosynthesizing, they need oxygen that is dissolved in the water to breathe. If they don't have it, they will die. So that can create what we call dead zones. And dead zones can occur in, again, a lot of different situations, and we'll talk about a few of those. So this word here, this is the big one, eutrophication. What is eutrophication? Eutrophication is basically the water chokes itself to death. What I mean by that is this. I don't mean to laugh, but when you say it aloud, it does kind of sound funny. It's basically the water has too many nutrients in it. And yes, that can be a bad thing. Oxygen's not a nutrient. Oxygen is oxygen. But when we talk about nutrients, we're talking about things like ammonia, nitrates, phosphates, all these other compounds, salts that can be dissolved in the water itself. And if there's too much of that, then that can basically make again a toxic environment and kill off the living things. So eutrophication is bad. Now, to make it worse, we can add humans. We can have cultural eutrophication. So cultural eutrophication is where we make it that way. Golf course ponds, huge example of this. Golf course ponds, what do we do to golf courses? We treat the crap out of them with fertilizers. Where does that fertilizer run off into? Into the golf course pond. And what does that do? Well, I'm going to give you an example in just a second. All right. Now, and we just said how it can be caused by things such as nutrients and fertilizers. Again, another example would be, let's say there is a factory along a riverway and it dumps some other byproduct into the water from its factory, from its production line. That can also raise the nutrient level in the water, and that could cause it as well. So let me go back to the golf pond. So let's say a lot of fertilizer gets dumped into the pond. Well, there's algae in the pond. Algae love that fertilizer because they like it. They start to reproduce like crazy. Now the pond is completely covered in algae. Two things have happened. One, the photic zone where the light can get through down to the lower parts of the pond, it's blocked now by algae. Right? So the plants that are down, like the aquatic plants that are actually living in the pond itself, now don't have access to sunlight to photosynthesize. They could die off. And then when they die off, guess what they do? They create more nutrients and more icky stuff, more of that stuff to increase that eutrophication. Another thing that could happen, all that algae that is growing, it's going to die suddenly, because what's going to happen is you are going to have an exponential growth rate. Remember that term? That exponential growth rate is going to peak. And then once it peaks, everything's going to die off because you've reached its carrying capacity and it can no longer be maintained. So then all that algae dies. Again, we have a ton of nutrient influx into the water source and very little oxygen. Everything else could possibly, many fish could die, especially smaller fish that are very susceptible to changes in nutrient levels. Bigger fish could die as well, turtles, all sorts of stuff, right? So eutrophication is bad stuff. It can completely devastate an ecosystem, and it can take a long time to recover from as well. All right, enough about that. Let's talk about disease-causing organisms. Yeah. All right. So we know that we have to have water to drink. We have to have water to shower and all these kinds of things. And whenever we flush it down the toilet or we unplug the bathtub, it's got to go somewhere. Well, a lot of times that bathwater, that sewage can contain pathogens. It can contain all sorts of different ones. The ones that are listed here are the ones that are the biggest issues for humanity: cholera, typhoid, Stomach flu would be things like that would just cause you to have upset stomach. Then you can also just simply get diarrhea, cholera, hepatitis. That's a good one too. So yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah. All right. Now, no matter where you go in the world, you're going to have some risk of this, but third world countries are obviously, you're at much higher risk of coming into contact with these types of pathogens. The water may not be treated nearly as well as it, and to a highest standards as it is here or in Europe, some other countries as well. So these are things to keep in mind when you travel. One thing that we use to help us identify whether water is safe is there are things called indicator species. And what indicator species are is they are basically they're like, if they exist, all right, if they exist, then I'm trying to think of the easiest way to say this. It's a species that can say, oh my gosh, if this species is there, then chances are we have some of this bad stuff in the water. Or it can be the flip side. An indicator species can also be a very sensitive species of, say, fish. And if they are living in that body of water, it means it's very clean water. So an indicator species can work both ways. There's a little fish that live here in Texas and in Oklahoma and Missouri. They're called darters. Darters. They are so cute, and they are extremely susceptible to any fluctuation in water quality. So we consider them to be an indicator species. All right, let's talk about something else that's really good. Fecal coliform bacteria. All right, yeah. Now, we know that in our intestines we have bacteria. We know this. Well, whenever you poop, some of that goes with it. And to us ourselves, to you yourself, it's not harmful. It's in your system. However, once it's released, and then it can grow and it can reproduce, and it comes into contact with other stuff. Guess what? It can be very dangerous to other organisms and other people. And so, yeah, fecal coliform bacteria is gross. And so that is one of the things that we monitor in drinking water. Now, when you flush the toilet, when you get out of the shower, where does the wastewater go? Well, it does one of two things. If you live out in the sticks, like where my parents live, they live way out in the country, they have a septic system. And the another thing that you could do, basically what a septic system is you have like an underground storage for your poop outside your house. And every so many years, you add stuff to it, enzymes and stuff to help break it down over time. You might have to have it pumped out. Gross. And other more common here where we live in urban areas are sewage treatment plants. And if we were in person, we would go see it in person and smell it. It's awesome. It's a great tour, but we don't get to go because COVID. Yeah. All right. So, but sewage treatment plants help treat sewage treated water, tainted water, and they can treat it to different levels of cleanliness. All right, so let's kind of real quickly here. So I already kind of went over what a septic system is. A septic tank is what contains all the poop. And it's out where we call it a leach field. And it's kind of the part where it's out from the house, and sometimes the grass grows really well there because guess what's underneath of it? Yeah, your big septic tank. And so, yeah, it's kind of gross. Yeah. All right. So this is what looks like in a fancy schmancy septic tank and a more modern one. Some more antiquated ones aren't nearly as nice. Yeah, kind of gross. All right. So now let's talk about sewage treatment plants. This is where the money's at because this is where we live. Now, municipalities spend a lot of money in doing research on this. And SAWS has a really cool one, actually. There's two ways that we treat this. We have a primary phase of treatment and a secondary phase of treatment. So basically what happens is you flush. It goes bye-bye under in the pipes, and then it gets screened out. So when it gets screened out, that's where stuff gets removed that got washed into like the drain sewers and stuff, like bikes, ramen wrappers. I'm not kidding you. Syringes, yeah, gross stuff, diapers. Oh, it's so gross. All right. So, and then we go to primary treatment. So what happens in primary treatment is the bad solid gunk sinks to the bottom. And it kind of works through, and some bacteria start to kind of help break it down. Yay, bacteria. This is really good, guys. And so that's one thing that happens. Secondary treatment is whenever it has gone past that stage. And what we can do here is, in secondary treatment, is we oxygenate it. It doesn't smell at this point, I promise. And there's a lot of other things that we can do to it here to kind of help prevent, to help remove any of the bad bacteria, the viruses, anything that's else is in there. And again, all the bad solid stuff sinks to the bottom because it's more dense, and then it's removed. So then the water continues to move on, and it can be treated at different levels. So here in San Antonio, it does go through, they do chlorinate it enough to kill the germs, but then it does pass through some ultraviolet light to kill certain pathogens, which is pretty freaking cool. And then it can be passed back out into river, lakes, and stuff like that. San Antonio, it goes into the river and goes on downstream. And guess what? Other municipalities take that water in, treat it, and then use it. So what we dump out after it's treated has to be clean enough for someone else to use. Yes, that's right. Yep. All right. Remember, everything's all about recycling. Everything's about recycling, even poop water. Yep. All right. So that's humans. What about animals? All right. Well, a couple of chapters ago, we talked about farming practices in agriculture and feedlots. Well, feedlots are a huge issue when it comes to animal waste. So what happens is cows poop, chickens poop, pigs, whatever. And if they gave those animals hormones to make them grow faster, if they gave them shots of antibiotics to prevent them from getting sick because there's so many packed into a little bitty area, well, they're going to pass all that out too. And so we have to have a way of containing it so that way it just doesn't go straight into the environment. So they create what we call these manure lagoons. Doesn't that sound romantic? Manure lagoon. What? No. So, but basically what it does is it's like a big storage tank for manure. And again, bacteria, yay, the good guys here, they help break it down into usable fertilizers and compost. Yeah. Yeah. So the bad stuff gets turned into good stuff. That's right. All right. We're going to pause here and move on to the next module in the next one.